Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
In August of 2006, I was working in Northern California and was interested in finding Bigfoot prints. I have a friend who is a member of the Hoopa First Nation. I contacted him and then spoke to an elder. I was taken to an area where some footprints had just been found. Being skeptical, I took my right boot off and stepped down next to the footprint. I am 6 feet 5 tall and weigh 295 pounds and wear size 18 boots. I am of Lakota Sioux lineage and speak a number of First Nation languages. After putting on my boots, we heard a screaming howl. My friend started saying Oh-mah was coming and we had to leave. My friend Dave told his elder about what I had done and we went back to the site 3 hours later. There were numerous large footprints surrounding mine and what I believe to be a large finger hole in the middle of my footprint. I was contacted a couple of weeks later and invited back to the reservation, as they normally lose a good portion of their apple crop to Oh-mah, but in 2006 they didn't lose anything. They wanted to know if I could come back every year and walk around barefoot to intimidate Oh-mah, and if I have any big friends my size. Oh-mah either saw me with the much shorter native people and thought I was another Oh-mah, or recognized the footprint as a threat. The elder thought Oh-mah didn't want a confrontation with something almost as big as him and left the area. The Oh-mah footprint was the same length as mine, but 1.5 inches wider at the ball and 3/4 of an inch wider at the heel. The depth of the print was the same. I have spoken with some so-called experts from the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization and from the Bigfoot Discovery Project and got laughed at, but then they wanted me to come with them and speak to the Bigfoot via bullhorn in either native language. I would rather not be used by someone who is too narrow-minded for me to speak to them.
About 20 years ago, I was walking an old trail through an open field between my grandparents' home and my dad's place on the res. Broad daylight. Sun was shining. Beautiful day. A typical walk I took every single day. Wasn't a lot of distance between the two homes. Maybe a few hundred feet. I was about halfway through the field when I saw something I had never seen before. Scared the crap out of me, so I stopped in my tracks and ducked down to ground level. What I saw was an enormous bird. It was standing on the ground. It must have known I was there because it flew up and away. The wingspan was insane. About 10 to 15 feet wide. Legit looked like one of those ancient dinosaur birds you see in pictures. I lay on the ground watching it as it flew off towards the forest. I can still hear the swooshing sound of the wings as it took flight. That was it, never seen it again. We have different varieties of birds here in Ontario, Canada. Eagles, blue herons, hawks. But no known species of bird is as huge as the one I saw that day. I ran right to my grandparents and told them what I saw. I had a feeling my grandpa knew what I had seen, but he never said anything. Oh, and I was around 20 to 23 years old at the time, so not a kid who may have been exaggerating. Wondering if anyone has ever seen something similar on their res.
I'm a First Nations person, Cree, from a reservation in Canada. I grew up in different reserves with different family members. We all have a common factor: if something of another being is bugging you, then someone is inviting it. We believe this is a negative outlet. This happened when I was 7 years old. My sister and I were visiting our Nokum and Nimisom's house. The adults decided to go to bingo, and they got the eldest cousin there to babysit everyone. His name was Corey, who was 16. My grandparents' home has a few trees around their home that they planted, and outside of that is a straight field to the next mile. They farmed. We were outside all day there. My cousin Corey was sitting on the patio as we were all jumping on the trampoline, and he was watching us. I went inside, and when I went back out, I jumped up on the edge of the patio to jump off onto the trampoline. My sister, who was 5, and my other cousin, who was 5, were already on the trampoline, stood in my way. I was telling them to move as I was about to jump, but they were completely fixated on the field. So I looked towards the field. There were two things coming towards our area in the field. The field is about a mile long, but you could see two huge black things like hopping coming down the field. They'd come up then down, like a snake taking a peek, in perfect unison together. I called Corey and pointed towards the field. He told us all to get inside the house and lock up, as he didn't know what they were. We did as we were told. I don't remember much after going in, but it was like I just came to and I was crying. My sister was beside me crying, and my other cousin Charlene, who was about 11 at the time, crying, holding my little cousin Cass. I got up to go to the front door and Corey was running back in. He said those things are circling the house. He was trying to run across the road to the neighbors. The phone just stopped working and it was just a bunch of kids home. I went back to the couch to sit with my sister so we can comfort each other. When I got to her, she told me to look at the window, so I did. Those things were looking in. They had their hands against the window as they peeked in. They looked like crocodiles, but shaped like humans. Their face wasn't as long as a crocodile's. They had 5 fingers, but they weren't human fingers. They had long nails with crocodile-like skin and walked standing upright. They wore long black cloaks or something on themselves. They stood at the window for only a few seconds and took off. Not long later, our grandparents got home with my uncle. We all went running to them crying, telling them what happened. My grandparents are very traditional and told us they had to leave and needed us to go to my aunt's on another reserve. My aunt came to get us not long later. My uncle was upset. He drove around the field looking for whatever they were. But when we all jumped into my aunt's retro van to go to her house, those things were behind Nimisomes. Then they ran south. I always thought that this was a dream. But then, at one family gathering, I mentioned it to everyone who I recall was there and they all remembered it.
My grandfather was a real badass. He was born in Alberta, Canada during the early 30s, and raised his 3 brothers on a reservation from the time he was 9. This was after his parents left for British Columbia with their only daughter, promised to return, and none of the boys ever saw them again. To make ends meet, he learned carpentry and worked as a laborer, and bare-knuckle boxed against older men for extra cash. He learned how to track and hunt, and always came home with something to eat when work was scarce. When he was 14, he put the second oldest brother in charge of the household, left the res in search of his parents and a better life, and never went back. That was the last time he saw any of his family members. He spent several months riding the rails, befriending some transients while using his fighting skills to defend himself against others. He eventually made his way to Vancouver, the last known whereabouts of his parents and sister, and started working in a pulp mill. At 17, he met my grandmother, and the two eventually married, leading to him giving up his search for his family. They bought some land, and he spent his free time building several houses, which still stand today. One of those sat on the land he bought with my grandmother, which included acres of wooded area. On this land, my grandparents kept horses and small farm animals for eggs and meat. My aunt was born in the early 50s, and then my mother came along right before the end of the decade. As far as I've heard, nothing bad or strange really happened until my mom found an old Ouija board and played with it by herself. But, I don't know if that has any relation to this story. My mother was around 8 when she was riding her horse through the wooded part of their acreage, when the horse stopped dead in its tracks. My mom tried to spur it on, but it was frozen in fear, and all of a sudden she smelled something like rotting garbage and meat. She pulled back on the reins and the horse instantly turned and took off back towards the house, almost knocking her off its back several times along the way. Afterwards, that horse was never the same. It would try to kick her, and if she got on it, it would fall backwards, trying to crush her beneath it. Once, it started acting like its old self again, letting her climb onto it. But once she did, it ran towards the road and stopped abruptly, bucking her forward into the path of an oncoming car. My grandpa saw it happen and put a shotgun to its head, and the horse just kept breathing heavily and staring straight ahead. My mother barely missed being run over by a car that saw the horse coming and managed to swerve out of the way, and my grandmother begged my grandfather not to shoot the horse. He finally decided to give it away when he saw that my mother wasn't badly injured. That same horse fell on the next person to ride it, breaking her collarbone, and the father did what my grandpa said he should have done the first time. After that, animals started going missing, and one of the hunting dogs was injured by something during an attack at night. My grandpa set out some traps and stayed in the hayloft above the barn with a shotgun and rifle beside him, and slept out there for several nights. He figured it was foxes, or maybe coyotes or wolves, or even a desperate bear, which is what he attributed the smell in the woods to and the horse's reason for losing its mind. But nothing came the entire time he slept out there, and eventually he figured it had moved on to easier prey or died. The day after he stopped sleeping in the barn, my mom was out near the tree line playing with the injured dog as it was healing. Out of nowhere, the dog started sniffing the air, then positioned itself between my mom and the trees, growling and barking. My grandpa heard the noise and came out, stopped in his tracks, and called back to my grandmother to bring his rifle, then whistled for the dogs. My grandma came out, handed him his gun, then asked what was going on. As the dogs all started to react like the first one, my grandfather pointed to one of the treetops, which looked longer and thicker than those around it, but it was very slightly moving. It was at least 6 feet tall, he told me later on when he'd retell the story, but probably a good bit taller. He took aim and fired just as he saw a pair of wings start to open up. Whatever was up there was watching them, but he beat it to the punch. It was a kill shot, directly in the chest with a high-powered rifle, and he instantly started running forward with all of the dogs following him as the thing plummeted to the ground, the breaking of tree branches wholly unmistakable. When he reached the impact point, he raised his rifle again and commanded the dogs forward to flush it out, but they all just stood in the spot and kept spinning around, trying to catch a scent that seemingly disappeared. A pile of broken branches lay in an obvious landing spot, but beyond that there was no proof that anything had happened. No body, no blood, no trail. It had either disappeared or gone straight back up the way it came. He searched those woods for several days but never found a sign of what that thing was, and they didn't see it or experience issues with the animals after that. Decades later, when he was dying, he kept talking about how he saw something. In his delirium, he referred to it as an alien, but said it was coming back for him. I've never seen that man scared of anything in my life, but there was actual panic and fear in his voice. A few nights before he died, he had already been too weak to stand on his own for several days, and my grandmother awoke to the sound of a gunshot. She ran outside, fearing the worst, and saw my grandpa lowering his rifle, staring at something in the distance. She took the gun away and helped him back inside, and that was it. I don't know if whatever it was actually did come back for him, or if it was a hallucination of an old memory, but I'd like to think he went out with a final F***CKU to the thing that tried to torment his family all those years ago.
Last year, I was on a 140-kilometer kayak trip in northern British Columbia. I was over my head, but that's beside the point. On the second day of camping, I was fishing from my kayak in the morning. I felt uneasy for some unexplained reason. I found a bend on the river I was on. I beached the kayak and started looking around. There were literally hundreds of small carved native tributes everywhere. These were carved rocks showing screaming Sasquatch for lack of a better term. I wondered who had put them here and why, but I soon realized that these were medicine man tributes. It was like this was a warning, but I ignored my thoughts. I also found tracks all over the place that were just days or weeks old. I've got size 14 boots. These footprints were much bigger than my feet. The prints had only 2 large toes, nothing I have ever seen before. Before I left, I saw a bunch of small tracks with 2 toes that were half my shoe size. There were also native tributes buried inshore. I dug up a few as proof before I pushed my kayak into the water. When I got back to my companions, I showed them what I had found. Now one wants to associate with me. My native side tells me that what I found was taboo. I'm scared to go back to my homeland and my native lands because I dug up a medicine man's tribute. I went back to the location recently to return the tribute rocks back to the shore. I took tobacco as an offering and screamed to the Creator to forgive me and not punish my son. I'm a bush guy, but I've never been so scared in the wilderness before or thought I would ever be worried about a creature, but it's there and I know where. I don't want to be exposed or be treated as a bad person. I've gotten enough of that already. I spend my life in the bush and I can't explain what I saw, or can I forget my fear?
I live in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm 30 years old and I was born and raised here. I've been outdoors fishing since I was very young and grew up as a fishing guide. There are things in these woods besides Sasquatch. I need to know what they are and how to be prepared. My first experience happened when I was 8 years old, around the year 2000. My dad and I were on a local river on the Kenai Peninsula fishing for king salmon in mid-June. We got to the river around 9:00 p.m. It was my dad's routine to fish all night from around 9 or 10 p.m. until early in the morning. Around 3 a.m. the king salmon run up the river really well in the middle of the night, and during that time of year, it never gets too dark, only for about an hour. Then it starts to get light again. My dad fished all night as I sat on the camp chair on the bank playing my Game Boy. We each had our limit of 2 king salmon each by about 2 a.m., so we packed up and started to walk the trail back to the parking lot. It was about a mile or so hike. At that time of night, there was no one else fishing, and it would always creep me out having to hike back in the dark carrying fish. That night we were followed by something that was breaking sticks and making this crazy hooping and hollering sound. My dad said to keep close, that it was just a bear, but I knew from the sound of my dad's voice and his hiking speed increased that he didn't think it was just a bear either. See, that's what sucks when Sasquatch does that to innocent people, especially when they're on their way home. Another time while driving the dirt road out from that same river at around 4 a.m. or so, we both saw this figure on the side of the road. It was whitish gray, with no eyes, no mouth or nose, and it was very skinny. It was just standing on the side of the road like a hitchhiker would. We slowed down as we got close, thinking it was a local guy or something, but as we got closer we both realized it definitely was not human. We looked at each other with wide eyes and said at the same time, "WTH was that?" After we pass it, my dad steps on the gas and we go flying down the dirt road faster than we ever had before. One summer while working with the Parks and Recreation Department when I was 21, I was on a crew with a native Alaskan guy who was about 50 or so. One day we got to talking and he asked me about a sticker I have on my van. It's a Sasquatch holding a fish. He asks, "Why do you have that sticker on your car? Do you believe in Sasquatch?" I said that I do believe, and that there was a lot of stuff in the woods I have no clue about and that not many people like to talk about. He told me that he was from Dillingham, where they called him the Hairy Man, and that he's seen a few. He said around Dillingham they are not friendly and to be careful while hunting or fishing in the deep woods. He told me a story of when he and his wife went out on their boat up the river to go fishing. They pull off into a back channel and go up a slough looking for fish. His wife says, "Stop. Look." There was a hairy man standing in the water looking straight at them. He cuts the engine and it just stands there looking pissed, like they had blown up his fishing hole. It takes a few huge steps and is out of the slough and makes this crazy loud roar and is gone within seconds. He turns the boat around and heads back down river. I asked him why don't people talk about this more, because people need to know about these things. He said the white man just laughs at the native people's stories and calls it folklore and dismisses his people as crazy, so why even try to tell them anymore? I nodded and agreed.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.